Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
What matters today? Communities are the shareholder. We're going to frame the episode with a series of questions at the top. We want you to hold these questions dear, consider them as we step into the origins of how goods and services became monetized in our world, as we turn our attention to the roots of capitalism and colonialization and the enclosure of common lands and goods.
How do we balance self-preservation with the needs of our communities?
Does history tell us something about what can be possible when we work together for the common good?
Do we have an obligation or duty to the common good?
Should mutuality override the profit motivations of the individual?
Do most of us realize that personal profit, for most of human existence, stood secondary to the common good?
So when we talk about enclosure, when we talk about being on one side of the wall, one side of the gate, right? And us experiencing these gatekeepers, what is going on here? And we have to go back to England. Up until 1516, land existed in a practice known as the commons. This is another fractal expression, both economically and socially. This notion that we as people are organized in terms of common need, eschewing crime and ownership as much as possible. So that creates less possibility for enclosure. What's mine is yours, and vice versa. Something that helps us a lot in understanding the commons actually comes from an interview that you shared with me. Daniel Denver over on Jacobin talks with historian Peter Linebaugh, and Linebaugh breaks the commons down in the following way, and I quote, "The commons consists of two Latin principles, co meaning with, and munis meaning obligation or duty. So the notion of the commons has to do with what we owe each other as an aspect of mutuality rather than what we own." So he's even saying it's all around the ownership, right? It's all around where something is kept and who has access to it. So to further define the commons, we can see it as many things. This mutual aspect, this goal of meeting our basic human needs, right? Food and water and shelter and clothing and healthcare. How we all come together and work for those common goals. Now, looking at peasant and artisan life in medieval England is quite interesting, right? Because we go, oh, well, this must be a communist utopia, but they existed under feudalism. These artisan practices continue to exist in the world today under capitalism or techno-feudalism right now, this end stage that we're characterizing as techno-feudalism. But what is so incredibly deeply embedded here is this notion of sharing, how that continues to survive through these systems of extraction. And the fascinating aspect of this here is that the family is at the center of where these modes of sharing are first learned and experienced, right? What's interesting that Linebaugh points out in the piece is that in the place of the commons, few families are run on what we would call neoliberal principles. The child's needs come first, not the exchange. So this is all incredibly connected, even though we feel quite severed from this real place that was the commons. To better understand how we as Americans got to techno-feudalism, how we were severed from the commons, we're right there again in the 1500s. And what happens after the Kett's Rebellion is that the Church of England, it solidifies, ratifies its power, and issues the 39 Articles. One of these articles declares, this is really, really important, this language and how it bleeds into our life, right? One of these articles declares that the riches and goods of Christians are not common. So even in that wording, It's about enclosure. What is mine is not yours, defined by a religious belief. So another of these articles says that Christians may put violators to death. This notion of capital punishment and the abolition of the commons were thus established. And every English person had to swear to these articles to participate in civic life.
And if we look back to the roots of Christianity, to Paul's letters, was an inherent principle that had existed for at that point about 1500 years throughout the Christian world, which was that all things were held in common. We're now 500 years into that shift, that radical departure, because what occurred in England was naturally passed down into the Americas, right?
Yeah, the arm is long. It casts a long shadow from this moment
Yeah.
where the Church of England issues these 39 articles. But that's one of many steps that the church and state took on behalf of the wealthy to create what we're talking about here as enclosures. So at this point in 1516, we need to look at what was happening on the ground in relation to land ownership. An example that Linebaugh gives is how agronomist Arthur Young would travel from parish to parish. So he said, okay, hey, who has the most power over this particular spot? Well, if you're a Christian, you now can exert your right to ownership. You travel anywhere in England, and what do you see often? Hedges. You see these hedges, you see these stone walls. These are examples of what was going on in the 16th century with folks like Arthur Young. So until then, this is really, really key. One could subsist off of these commonly shared resources of the land. Subsistence was no longer possible under these enclosures. What we can offer you, the wealthy and powerful are saying, is that you can move to the city and you can work all day under new conditions where you don't own anything, or you can join the Navy or the Army and go overseas and exert our power to help us extract resources elsewhere.
So we can then begin to see that the enclosure, not just of the land, but also of crafts, was really enclosing other forms of subsistence. And only after that do we see the true crime that is the tragedy of the commons, the removal of the commons, not the story told by history that supports the notion that enclosure was a necessary part of building a more economically prosperous world. It's a myth. It's a story told by capitalism as the winner of an historic period of time. The problem is that the story doesn't hold up to facts. And when the commons is destroyed, then people have to steal to live. Until then, it wasn't necessary. And it's an alien notion in our world. To quote Linebaugh directly, the process of criminalization extends across all the trades. A tailor, prior to that, had taken what was called cabbage. That was the word used for the leftover cloth. A sailor took chips. A docker took sweepings. A tobacco worker took stockings. And we can go through every trade and see how there's a transition during this process of expropriation where the worker persists in taking some of the fruits of the labor, even though, according to statute, it was now theft. And over time, it was gradually just weeded out through the legal system. And now you have to find old dictionaries, even specialized ones, to explain the terms that I just shared with you. This is how effective capitalism has been in forcing us to forget the roots of our shared existence. A recent example we can plainly see is the creation of Doge under the leadership of Elon Musk. Its misuse of power and then ultimately the theft of our personal information is another example of modern enclosure. His attempt to remove any and all rights for workers in order to bring the workplace into a vision where nothing can ever be shared in common. All resources are controlled at the highest levels within corporate entities, a version of enclosure that most closely resembles life with Big Brother from 1984.
Certainly. Something to lament. But as a counter to what happened last year with Doge, what continues to happen under other corporate entities like Palantir and Oracle, I'd like to go back to Kionzer's article where Ron Eglash talks about something else and really directly relates it to this AI moment. So Eglash is stating here that modern economies tend to define value more narrowly, and it goes upward. The recent AI boom offers a vivid example. Large language models such as ChatGPT are trained on vast data sets that include legally protective creative work. Yet many creators receive nothing when their work is absorbed into these systems, a practice that has already triggered lawsuits. What he's getting at there is techno-feudalism. Here's your artwork. It's online. Well, we own the platforms and the systems which hold it online. We can take it. So this is cool. In response to this, Eglash and a team of global creatives have built something called Ubuntu AI. It's a platform specifically for African artists and designers where they can upload their work and get paid if companies want to use it to train AI. So Eglash puts it this way. We found out we were the only group trying to democratize the AI economy. Everyone else was just following OpenAI's directive to have citizen input on AI policy. But while there is nothing wrong with adding an input to AI policy, it does little to create value for everyday people and little to improve social cohesion among communities of creators and AI companies. Eglash says that we pointed out that at the local scale, here it is, you want community ownership of AI. How do you bring together the global and the local? Right back to his main thesis, it's fractal scaling of democracy. Now, Eglash is actually doing this in a multitude of ways and places. There's a project in Detroit that he's backed that pursues a similar logic with Black-owned cooperatives, worker-owned businesses, and other community ventures. This premise is simple. When local enterprises rely on outside platforms for essential services such as web hosting, delivery routing, payment processing, banking, money steadily leaks out of the community. Even when the business itself is local, the infrastructure beneath it may be extractive. Venmo, PayPal, there you go, right? So this project in Detroit has an aim to rebuild some of that infrastructure so that the value generated by local work returns to local people, not just the workers, but the communities. Again, regeneration, egalitarian regeneration.
So, we've been talking about shared commerce that serves communities first and foremost, rather than solely through the lens of the stockholder. And let's acknowledge that the stockholder is a predominantly disengaged investor with a singular intent: profit. Qualitative considerations, primary concerns for a community, have little consideration for quantitative investment. Money overrides people through this Wall Street lens every time. A leap from this quantitative and limited visioning of investment in our world into one where local communities serve as the investment, the fractal building block. In a world where interconnection and shared equitable distribution of resources serves as, in my mind, as the primary model for a viable and living world that we're talking about. And, as we've explored egalitarian regeneration and its antithetical expressions from the past and present, we'd like to now focus on having short bits around what kind of ails our communities.
So join us next time on the podcast as we explore examples of this ailment within childcare, education, healthcare, and the ways in which egalitarian regeneration is all about the common good. Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.